Welcome to week 3 of our series for 12 right now. Today's focus is called You Have a Future. And so we started with the past, and our kind of main idea with that one was that you have a past, everyone has a past, and what God can use with your past. And then last week we talked about you have today, and that God often uses us in our present moment and what we can do in our present moment. We've also been studying a little bit of Moses, and so we'll continue that today. But I want to show you a clip from it's really the trailer, I guess, for the Marvel Endgame movie, which is funny because I'm really not a movie person, and it's even funny too because I had to watch the movie this week to kind of understand what was going on. So there's 2 things I want you to focus on though when you watch the clip, and if you've seen the movie then obviously you know what this is about. But anytime there's any sort of movie or show or anything having to do with time travel, there's usually 2 points that are made kind of in the moment or before they do it. And one of the things is you can't change the past. So obviously in the movie Endgame, spoiler alert, they are going in the past to change it, that's their whole purpose. But usually when you time travel, you're told not to change the past or not to mess with the past. Another thing you're often told is not to come in contact with your future self. So when you go into the past, you're not supposed to come in contact with yourself. Anyway, it makes sense once you see the trailer. So enjoy that, and I'll be right back.
On April 26th.
You know your teams, you know your missions. No mistakes, no do-overs. Look out for each other. This is the fight of our lives.
He's pretty good at that, right? Avengers Endgame. Rated PG-13. Tickets on sale now.
All right, cool. Got it. All right, so enjoy the movie. If you haven't already seen it, I encourage you to do that. I know there are some people that have watched all the Avengers or are doing a movie marathon, so enjoy. Okay, so there were obviously a few times in my life where I really wish I could see into the future. Obviously right now I think is the big one. I think all of us wish we could kind of see into the future and kind of know what is next for our next step with all of this. Other than right now, because I think we all want it right now. For me, another time was when I was graduating college. And it's funny that we're studying Moses in this series, because I would tell people, I just wish I had a burning bush. I wish God would just talk to me the way he talked to Moses and tell me what he wanted me to do. My degree was in communications, and I had all these interviews with news stations and radio stations, and I just knew that wasn't really what I wanted to do. I loved ministry, but I just wasn't sure how to do it, and I wasn't sure how to get started, and it was so frustrating. And so I wanted so badly to, when I was in college, those last few semesters, I really wished I could see into the future so that I could just know where I was supposed to be and make that decision so much easier. Another time I really wished I could see my future was when twice when I made a career change. So I went into ministry right after college, and I did that for about 5 years, and then I kind of felt called to do something else, but I was so unsure about it. I was so nervous to leave this thing that I was comfortable doing, and I ended up becoming a teacher. Another 5 years, fast forward into that, I left teaching and went back into ministry. And it's one of those things where prior to teaching, if I could have seen into the future and known this isn't going to work out, you're not going to be a teacher forever, you're going to end up back in ministry, would I have stayed? I don't know, right? That's part of what just trusting in God and trusting in our path and the path that he has for us is supposed to be and do. The other time I think I wished I could see into the future was in my early dating days, right? Anytime I would date somebody, I would think, oh my gosh, is he the one? I don't know. Is he? Could he be? And I don't know. And it was so frustrating and so hard. And obviously Andy and I are married, and it's wonderful, and we have Lila, and it's been so great. But it's one of those things, any guy I dated before Andy, if I could see into the future, what would that have done for me, knowing that this person wasn't it? Or when I finally met Andy, knowing that Andy was the one? Who knows, right? Here we are. Okay, so the other thing that I kind of want to mention in all of this because this is kind of the theme that we've been talking about throughout this whole lesson, is my question, I guess, and I want you to kind of ponder for a minute, is do you ever compare your future to someone else's future? So maybe do you look at a friend and that friend is super talented and they're super smart and they get good grades all the time and they always make every team that they try out for, and you think that person has such a bright future. They can do whatever they want. They just have so much going for them. And then you look at yourself and you think, well, mine isn't that exciting, or my future isn't that promising. Like, I don't know if I can have the same opportunities they can, right? Like, I know I've done that before, and I'm sure we do, but what we are trying to remember through all of this, as in this series, is to focus on what we have versus what we don't have, right? The whole series is called The Haves and the Have-Nots. So focus on what your future looks like, not what your friends' futures look like. So the other thing to think about with this is the other huge part about future and time travel is that we never know how long our time on earth is, right? So whether we have one more day on earth or 100 years left on this earth, you have some sort of future. Just like we all have some sort of past, we came from somewhere, we all have some sort of future. Now, obviously, the length of that future is different for everybody, but we all have some sort of future. And what I want you to hear from all of this is that your future is in God's hands, and in God's hands, it is good. Okay, so hear that, and then we'll come back to that in a little bit. All right, so Moses had a past. We talked about that. God used him in the present moment to send him to go back to Pharaoh and to free his people. Obviously, Moses feared and doubted and tried to get out of it, and God made him do it anyway. Okay, so I'm going to show you a clip from the Bible Project, and this is a great online resource on how to study and read the Bible, and it's the first half of Exodus. So they're going to explain basically what I've already told you about Moses being born. They don't go into a lot of detail about him, the reason why he left Egypt, obviously, but it's more of kind of his time in Egypt and then the plagues and setting the Israelites free. So watch that if you want. Obviously, you can fast forward if you want, but I will be right back. So see you in a second.
The book of Exodus. It's the second book of the Bible, and it picks up the storyline from the previous book, Genesis, which ended with Abraham's grandson, Jacob, leading his large family of 70 people down to Egypt. Now, Jacob's 11th son, Joseph, had been elevated to second in command over Egypt, and he had saved his whole family in a famine. And so Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, offered the family to come live there as a safe haven. And so eventually Jacob dies there in Egypt, and Joseph and all his brothers do too. About 400 years pass, and the story of the Exodus begins. Now, that name refers to the event that takes place in the first half of the book, Israel's exodus from Egypt. But the book has a second half that takes place at the foot of Mount Sinai. In this video, we'll just focus on the first half, where centuries have passed, and the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied, and they filled the land. Now, this line is a deliberate echo back to the blessing that God gave all humanity back in the Garden of Eden. And it reminds us of the big biblical story so far. Humanity forfeited God's blessing through sin and rebellion, and so God chose Abraham's family as the vehicle through which he would restore his blessing to all the world. But the new Pharaoh does not view Israel as a blessing. He actually thinks this growing Israelite immigrant group is a threat to his power. And so just as in Genesis, humanity rebels against God's blessing, so here Pharaoh attempts to destroy the source of God's blessing, the Israelites. He brutally enslaves them in forced labor, and then he orders that all the Israelite boys be drowned in the Nile River. Now, Pharaoh, he is the worst character in the Bible so far. His kingdom epitomizes humanity's rebellion against God. Pharaoh has so redefined good and evil according to his own interests that even the murder of innocent children has become good to him. And so Egypt has become worse than Babylon from the book of Genesis. And so now Israel cries out for help against this new Babylon, and God responds. God first turns Pharaoh's evil upside down as an Israelite mother throws her boy into the Nile River, but in a basket. And so he floats safely right down into Pharaoh's own family. He's named Moses, and he grows up to eventually become the man that God will use to defeat Pharaoh's evil. In the famous story of the burning bush, God appears to Moses and commissions him to go to Pharaoh and order him to release the Israelites. And God says that he knows Pharaoh will resist, and so he will bring his judgment on Egypt in the form of plagues. Then God also says that he will harden Pharaoh's heart. And so we're introduced into the next main part of the story, the confrontation between God and Pharaoh. Now, what does this mean that God says he'll harden Pharaoh's heart? It's super important to read this section of the story really closely and in sequence. In Moses and Pharaoh's first encounter, we're told simply that Pharaoh's heart grew hard. There's no implication that God did anything. And so in response, God sends the first set of 5 plagues, each one confronting Pharaoh and one of his Egyptian gods. And each time, Moses offers a chance for Pharaoh to humble himself and to let the Israelites go. But after each plague, we're told that Pharaoh either hardened his heart or that his heart grew hard. He's doing this of his own will. And so eventually, it's with the second set of 5 plagues that we begin to hear how God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So the point of the story seems to be this. Even though God knew that Pharaoh would resist his will, God still offered him all of these chances to do the right thing. But eventually, Pharaoh's evil reaches a point of no return. I mean, even his own advisors think that he has lost his mind. And it's at that point that God takes over and bends Pharaoh's evil towards his own redemptive purposes. God lures Pharaoh into his own destruction as he saves his people, which is what happens next. With the final plague, it's the night of Passover, and God turns the tables on Pharaoh. Just as he killed the sons of the Israelites, so God will kill the firstborn in Egypt with a final plague. But unlike Pharaoh, God provides a means of escape through the blood of the Lamb. And here the story stops and introduces us in detail to the annual Israelite ritual of Passover. On the night before Israel left Egypt, they sacrificed a young, spotless lamb and painted its blood on the doorframe of their house. And when the divine plague came over Egypt, the houses covered with the blood of the lamb were passed over, and the son spared. And so every year since, the Israelites have reenacted that night to remember and to celebrate God's justice and his mercy. But Pharaoh, because of his pride and rebellion, he loses his own son, and he's compelled to finally let the Israelites go free. And so the Israelite slaves make their exodus from Egypt. But no sooner do they leave that Pharaoh changes his mind, and he gathers his army and chases after the Israelites for a final showdown. As the Israelites pass through the waters of the sea safely, Pharaoh charges towards his own destruction. The Exodus story concludes with the first song of praise in the Bible. It's called the Song of the Sea. And the final line declares that the Lord reigns as king. And then the song retells in poetry what the story of God's kingdom is all about. It's about how God is on a mission to confront evil in his world and to redeem those who are enslaved to evil. God is going to bring his people into the promised land where his divine presence will live among them. This story is what it looks like when God becomes king over his people. So after the Israelites sing their song, the story takes a sharp turn. The Israelites, they're trekking through the wilderness on their way to Mount Sinai, and they're hungry, they're thirsty, and they start criticizing Moses and God for even rescuing them. They say they long for the good old days in Egypt. I mean, it's crazy. So God graciously provides food and water for Israel in the wilderness, but these stories, they cast a dark shadow. And we begin to wonder, could it be that Israel's heart is just as hard as Pharaoh's? We shall see. But for now, that's the first half of the book of Exodus.
All right. So here we go. We're back. So through Moses, right, God delivered his entire nation to freedom. So if you didn't watch the video, I'll give you a really quick recap on it. So basically, again, the whole premise of the video is it's the first half of Exodus. Pharaoh is afraid of the Israelites taking over, and that's why he decided to enslave them and make them work for him. So in order to do that, he orders, so in addition to that, he orders for all Hebrew boys to be killed. Moses is adopted into Pharaoh's family. Moses then encounters the burning bush. That's where God talks to him. God says, so this is what I thought was really interesting, and they made a big point of this, but I thought it was interesting to point out too, that God says he will harden Pharaoh's heart. God says, And the first 5 plagues that each time Moses gives Pharaoh a chance to change his mind, and he doesn't do it. So those first 5 plagues are kind of Pharaoh hardening his own heart, I think, towards the Israelites, whereas the second 5 plagues, or the last set of 5 plagues, God is hardening Pharaoh's heart. And obviously it's the last plague where the firstborn son is killed. Pharaoh's own son has died, but God obviously told his people to put the blood of a lamb on their door frame, and so the angel of death passed over them, and that is the celebration of Passover that the Jewish people still celebrate today. Okay, Pharaoh changes his mind, sends the Israelites, tells them to go, and then halfway through decides it's a bad idea, so he sends out his army to go grab them. But that's when Moses parts the Red Sea. Pharaoh's army runs after them to get them into the water, and then God puts the sea back to normal and they all drown, right? Then the Israelites are wandering and hungry in the desert. They actually at one point say to Moses that they would rather be back enslaved in Egypt than wandering around in the desert, which is crazy to think about. So obviously the book of Exodus continues. Moses has a long legacy, and there's so much more. If you want to read that, you obviously go ahead, but we're going to stop right there for now. The one thing that I do want to point out that I had never noticed before is that Moses truly does have an amazing legacy. So at this point, he still has a future. He eventually dies. Again, we'll get to that later. But what I thought was really cool is that he is mentioned in the New Testament more than any other Old Testament figure. So like big figures like Daniel and Abraham and people that we've heard about for all this time, Jesus talks about Moses more than any other people, which I think is really cool. So again, I want you to hear, no matter what happens in our future, that God can be trusted with it. Okay, so I'm going to skip to the New Testament a little bit because, like I said, Jesus mentions Moses a lot. But I think the other thing that I want you to hear from the New Testament is just kind of how like our future is, how we can leave our future in God's hands. Okay, this is Romans. So Paul is writing to the Romans, and this is in the New Testament. This is Romans chapter 8, verse 28 and 30. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those that God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed in the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And that those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he justified. And those he justified, he also glorified. So again, Paul reminding us that God has our futures in his hands. The other one that I want to read is from 1 Peter. So this is 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 3 through 5. Praise be to the God Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, soil, or fade. This inheritance is kept in heaven for you, who through faith has shielded by God's power until the coming of salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time. Okay, so if you have trust in Jesus, then you have a future in Jesus. So that's the other thing I want you to hear. I kind of have a challenge for you. This is actually really hard. Well, part of it was really hard for me, but I want you to grab a piece of paper, and at the top, I'm going to show it to you, but it's going to be backwards. So just so you have an idea of what it looks like. But at the top, I want you to write your life map. And then I want you to write next year. And then under that in 5 years, and then under that in 10 years. And I want you to think about what you want your life to look like. What do you want to do? Who do you want to be? Now, I think a regular Joe person writing something like this, in 1 year I want to make the soccer team or something like that. But I which is valid, I get that. But I think what the point of all of this is that I really, really challenge you to dream big. I mean, like dream crazy big, crazy huge, because God's in control. And so what can that look like? I want you to think about is who do you want to be? So not just what things you want to accomplish, but kind of who at your core do you want to be? Think about how will God's hope and mission for your life be evident? So when you look back at your life, how will you look and see, oh my gosh, like God was so present in that. I was so trusting of God and all of that. So I will read mine because, I'm all about transparency here and being authentic with y'all. So honestly, the hardest one for me was next year. I don't know, maybe it's just because we're in such an uncertain time right now that it's hard to think about a year from now because we can't even really think about 2 days from now. But so I actually did your 5 years from now and 10 years from now, and that one was so much easier for me than 1 year. And so I'll do the 5 and 10, and then I'll leave you with my 1 year next year. Okay, so I also kind of broke mine up into 2 categories. So 1 was family, and then 2 was more of career work stuff. So in 5 years, y'all, okay, this is dreaming big. This is God is in control. In 5 years, I'm hoping that we have fostered and or adopted a baby into our family. Okay, big, crazy, we'll see. Then on my work goal in 5 years, this is dreaming big, is to lead St. Andrew students on an international mission trip. Not saying it's going to happen. It's just one of my goals. I would love to do something like that in 5 years at St. Andrew. Okay, 10 years. So also keep in mind, in 10 years, I will be 45. So just different stage in life than now. So my personal goal in 10 years is to live in the Texas Hill Country. That's kind of Andy and I's dream, is to go out and move into the Texas Hill Country. Sorry, I would have to leave St. Andrew. This is 10 years from now. This is just a dream. Don't think I'm not leaving anytime soon. And the other, this is kind of the career portion of it, is that I would love, again, this is 10 years from now, love to be running some sort of ministry or camp at our ranch house. That's also kind of Andy and I's dream, is to run a Christian camp. So who knows? We'll see. Dream big, right? Okay. All right. Now, one other thing I did in preparing for this was kind of I wrote on these little note cards, because I think note cards are good things to place on your refrigerator, on your bathroom mirror, somewhere in your room, just to kind of remind you of the purpose of this lesson. So when you are tempted to compare yourself to someone else, this is what I want you to remember. And obviously you can read it, but what you already have is so much more valuable than what you worry you don't have. Okay? So when you think about comparing yourself, I want you to remember that. The other thing I want you to hear is, I have a purpose that is bigger than myself. I have a God that is willing to take me on an adventure and use me in ways I never thought possible. I have hope. So obviously that's kind of a long one, but I think a shorter version of that is, I have a future, and in God's hands, my future is good. All right, y'all, this was fun. Join me at 6 o'clock on Zoom. Code will be right after this. We'll play some kind of funny trivia games and hopefully discuss the lesson a little bit. So I hope you learned something new. I miss you guys so much. Like I said, as always, reach out to us. We miss you. We love you. I'll see y'all soon.